It's an exciting time in the treatment of epilepsy and in research into epilepsy. And this is something we'll be looking at probably a bit more later. But these are the kind of top 10 research priorities from Epilepsy Research UK. And I'm not going to go through each one one by one, but these encompass areas like mechanisms of epilepsy, how epilepsy begins, about new drug targets, about sudden unexplained death in epilepsy, and even the use of AI in the development of new research techniques and therapeutic techniques in epilepsy. So it's a really exciting time, and we'll go through more of these kind of research priorities later. But I'm going to talk for a few slides about new medications for epilepsy. And this slide just illustrates the kind of explosion of anti-seizure medications over the last sort of 20, 30 years, from one or two medications maybe 100 years ago to over 40 medications that we have now. So, and it certainly can make things rather complex when we're treating epilepsy. And again, often you have to see a specialist in epilepsy in order to find the right or best combinations or avoid interactions, or this just gives you a broad overview of the amount of anti-seizure medications that we have now. I will mention that we are using the term anti-seizure rather than anti-epileptic medication now, and that's because these medications really just suppress seizures. They don't do anything about the epilepsy itself, which is another problem. So we refer to them more as anti-seizure rather than anti-epileptic medications nowadays. That's relatively new. But how do all these drugs actually get here? And one of the main reasons they get here is because of you, because of patient participation in research and in drug trials. We wouldn't have any of these new treatments in epilepsy if it wasn't for patients. So that's one theme that I'm going to mention a few times, is to encourage your participation in any research that might be available. But for a medication to get from the left, which is kind of basic research and drug discovery, right through clinical trials to getting it approved then by, in Europe, the European Medicines Agency, to then it being manufactured and distributed, and then post-marketing surveillance and studies, it takes many, many, many years and often millions and millions and millions of euros. Certainly we can't do all of this in Ireland, but we are involved a lot, for example, in FutureNeuro and say drug discovery and in basic research and some preclinical studies. We have been involved over the years in some clinical trials, usually as part of a multi-center, multi-international trial for medications. And we've been involved in post-approval studies. We just published a big paper in a journal this year on one of the medications I'm going to refer to, cenobamate, about our experience with that. So we're involved across the range of this in bits and pieces, but not all together. We're a relatively small country and we can't do all of this on our own. So I'm going to go through a couple of the four drugs at the top of that kind of pyramid, the most recent ones that are either available or soon to be available, that you may or may not have heard of, but these are the newest ones on the block. So the first one is Epidiolex, and this is pharmaceutical grade cannabidiol or CBD. And this is now available over the last kind of year or so to prescribe. It's somewhat restricted in prescribing. It's a high-tech medication, and it's only approved in Ireland for specific indications, specific kinds of epilepsy, so not every form of epilepsy. So specifically, that's Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Dravet syndrome, in combination with clobazam and tuberous sclerosis, and over 2 years of age. So, but we have been using it, and it seems to work well. It seems to be fairly well tolerated. It doesn't work in everyone, but it comes as a liquid. And in this as with most of these medications, we kind of start slow and kind of build the dose up. And this new medication can have side effects such as dizziness or sedation and some interactions with other medications, but otherwise seems fairly safe. And we have seen some benefits as well in non-seizure symptoms too. So we've seen some benefits in sleep, benefits in behavior, benefits in attention. So this will be more interesting as we continue to use this drug over the next few years. So moving on to the next new drug that's available, well, soon to be available, we hope, Fintepla. Also, the drug name is fenfluramine. And this is also relatively restricted in use, so it's only going to be for, again, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or Dravet syndrome, two forms of epilepsy that start in childhood over 2 years of age. And it's currently going through pharmacovigilance in the Department of Health, so that can take anything from months to, over a year. But, from our colleagues in the UK and other countries, it seems to be a really good medication, well tolerated. Was used in the past in adults at higher doses for obesity, and they found that there was some thickening of some heart valves. So now we haven't found that when it's used in younger patients for seizures, but we have to do an echocardiogram at the beginning before starting treatment, and then every 6 months for 2 years, and then yearly afterwards. So, but we hope this will be available in the next year or so in Ireland, and we'll be using it. A new drug on the block, and this is available now on the long-term illness scheme as of about 3 weeks ago. It's called cenobamate. The brand name is Ontasri in Europe and Xcopri in the US. We have been using it over the last 2 years on an early access scheme using the brand name Xcopri, so some of you might be familiar with that brand name, but in Europe, the official kind of name for it is Ontasri. And this is for focal onset seizures over the age of 18. It is being studied for younger patients or other kinds of epilepsy, but hasn't got an approval for that yet. But yeah, it's a really good drug. So we've had a very good response to it, and coinciding with what was seen in the clinical studies there, as you can see on the lower right. So responders, there were that we define that as over 50% seizure reduction, 75% respond to the drug. So that's really high when you're talking about drug studies. And we've studied it in patients. This is where the drug studies were done, but it was done in patients with drug-resistant, difficult to control epilepsy, and about 13% of those patients became seizure-free for the duration of the study. So, and that's something that we don't see numbers that high in many of the other medications we have. So we've seen that in our clinical practice as well. It doesn't work in everyone again, but and isn't tolerated by everyone, but looks to be a kind of really good drug. And the fourth new drug I'm going to mention today is called Afinitor, or everolimus. And that's, again, quite a restricted drug now, so it's only approved or used in one particular condition, tuberous sclerosis, which is a particular form of genetic epilepsy. And in this case, we know in this condition that there's an overactivity of this mTOR pathway, and it kind of switches off or dials down this pathway, and in that way, clinical trials have shown seizure improvement. So we have been using it over the last sort of 2 or 3 years. It's also shown to reduce the growths of kinds of tumors we see in tuberous sclerosis as well, in both the brain and the kidneys. So we use it for that also. And again, with all these drugs, it has its own set of potential side effects that we have to deal with in some, but not all patients. So there are some other drugs that are in development, maybe a couple of years away, but if you go back 5 or 10 years, we would have been talking about drugs like brivaracetam or eslicarbazepine, being in the future, and now they're here and we're using them all the time. So these are drugs that we may see over the next kind of 5 to 10 years. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but just as an example of some of the drugs that we may be using in the next 5 to 10 years as well. I think we'll be up above 50 then, or 60 in numbers of medications. So I'd like to move on then, as I don't have so much time, into talking a little bit about new developments and diagnostic tests then for epilepsy that we've been using in Beaumont, for example, and other centres around the country. And I'm not going to talk much about genetics because Professor Cavaliere is going to talk about that in the next talk. But we have been doing more and more in the way of genetic testing, and now we don't find results in everyone, and often it's only very rare disorders that we actually find something that we can do something about. But there are exciting developments now in gene therapies or in enzyme replacement for, again, rare conditions, only so a select group of rare conditions. So for example, there's gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy now. There's enzyme replacement therapy for these rare diseases that some of which are being treated now, for example, in Temple Street. There was a treatment recently approved in the US for Rett syndrome. Now, not any kind of curative treatment. It improves the symptoms, but there is. We can be encouraged by that. There is will be over the next 5, 10, 15 years, more and more of these potential treatments or even gene therapies for different forms of epilepsy and other neurological disorders. So in terms of diagnostics, I do want to emphasize our epilepsy monitoring units that we have both in Beaumont and in Cork. And, this is our kind of gold standard diagnostic test for epilepsy, where we bring people into the epilepsy monitoring unit and, reduce the medication so that we can see the seizures and we can localize them or see them on the EEG, the brainwave test, and on video. And we get a huge amount of information, diagnostic information about epilepsy in that way. And we've had new equipment installed last year. We updated all our equipment and software. We're still even learning how to get the full use and benefit out of some of the new software that we have at the moment. So that's exciting. We have a new system for intracranial EEG. So that's putting EEG brainwave electrodes deep into the brain to study the epilepsy using this robot, the ROSA robot. And I'll mention that in the slide. But again, the benefits of getting monitored in the epilepsy monitoring unit are potentially huge. They did a study in Cork where 87% of the studies down there were conclusive in terms of finding the kind of, or the nature or the localization of that or type of that person's epilepsy. And it's the kind of gateway to getting epilepsy surgery as well, which is the single most effective treatment we have for focal epilepsy. So you have to get epilepsy monitoring first. Also effectively diagnoses non-epileptic seizures or attacks. And there's a lot of research opportunities for patients who are in the epilepsy monitoring unit. So we always tend to have a number of research studies ongoing, and we invite patients often to be involved in that. And I would encourage that if you or someone you know is in there. I'm going to just skip that for the sake of time, but this again is our intracranial EEG stereo EEG evaluation using the robot. Here's the robot again. It doesn't make a cup of tea or can't doesn't speak or anything like that, but it can very accurately place these EEG electrodes deep in the brain where we want them to go. So we can study the brain with epilepsy, and this is a big investment by Beaumont Hospital 2 or 3 years ago, and is used by our epilepsy surgeons, Professor Donncha O'Brien and Mr. Kieran Sweeney, who are really top class experienced epilepsy surgeons in using this and doing epilepsy surgery at Beaumont. And they're also involved in the research studies that we're involved in, both in Beaumont and through FutureNeuro and RCSI. And if you ever come across them, they'll probably maybe even talking to you about that. So in this kind of reasonably new diagnostic test for epilepsy, we want to find the epilepsy focus, and so we can potentially remove it surgically. And sometimes it's deep in the brain, so hard to find, like finding a needle in a haystack. So we can then insert these EEG electrodes deep in the brain after kind of mapping the blood vessels, so we avoid them, and then recording seizures in the epilepsy monitoring unit again. But it's very well tolerated. They see the person there. This is from the Bristol NHS website. Just sitting up, with the EEG electrodes in and a cap over them. So it's very well tolerated. It's not significantly uncomfortable or painful or anything. And if we just take them out, the person goes home the next day. So it is a very valuable new tool in our way of evaluating some of these for really difficult to control focal epilepsies. So again, I want to emphasize that there's a huge opportunity for both researchers and patients to benefit from the studies that we do in Beaumont and in other centres around the country and through FutureNeuro. It's giving us insight in how the brain with epilepsy works. There's so much we don't understand. We're constantly trying to improve our knowledge about epilepsy, and it's only through that we'll find new ways of treating it. So there's a potential for new therapeutics in that way, and we've some of our current projects, for example, is we're looking at how seizures spread in the brain and how we can predict that and predict where they're coming from. And we have another project where we're taking the stereo EEG electrodes, and instead of just throwing them away, with consent of the patient, we're studying them and studying the fluid around them and looking for tiny pieces of DNA or RNA from those electrodes to understand, what's different about the seizure focus in other areas of the brain, and can we get new information on that about diagnostics and therapeutics. So again, it's a partnership, in terms of participation in research, both for people being subjects of a study, to sharing our knowledge about research, which we're doing tonight, and working in partnership with the public, with patients, with government, and other Epilepsy Ireland and other organisations in promoting knowledge about epilepsy. And how am I doing on time? 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Including questions. Okay.
Questions after 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Just going to mention another diagnostic test we're doing in Beaumont, although strictly speaking, not quite at the moment, because this is a test where we inject a radioactive tracer through an intravenous line at the beginning of a seizure in the epilepsy monitoring unit. And unfortunately, we're not doing it at the moment because we don't have the radioactive tracer and we can't get it. And we don't know when we're going to get it, but whenever we do, we'll hopefully start them back up again. But in a seizure, there's increased blood flow, so this tracer maps or highlights where this increased blood flow is, and then we can take a picture of the brain with a SPECT scan, and it can show us literally a hotspot where the epilepsy is coming from. And you can imagine how useful this is for the surgeon to know, where is the epilepsy. And we'll get a picture like this, basically, where, if it's successful, not always so, but if we get a successful study, which we've done already, we see the seizure focus of the hotspot. So this is really exciting and new. This is another study we've been involved with in Beaumont in the Epilepsy Monitoring Unit called UNEEG, or subcutaneous EEG, where as part of this clinical study, we're actually implanting a EEG wire or electrode under the skin, and then it stays in, and you can walk around with it for weeks or months, and it records seizures, because we know that a lot of seizures are unreported. When people show up in the clinic, it's hard for us to know exactly how in control the epilepsy is. So this is a study we're doing along with the company that has this subcutaneous EEG device. As of last week, I understand there's one more slot. We're looking for one more patient for the study. So we're looking for people with generalized seizures who have over one tonic-clonic seizure a month. And you get this placed under local anaesthetic. You have 48 hours of monitoring the epilepsy monitoring unit, and then it stays in for the duration of the study before we take it out. So this is still sort of experimental. It's not in mainstream, but in a couple of years we might be seeing more of these, and this could be incredibly useful. I probably run out of time to talk about neuromodulation, but I do know that somebody else is talking about it later in the evening. But these are kind of new therapeutic ways of treating epilepsy. If you think about it, seizures are electrical, so why not treat the seizures with electrical therapeutics or electrical devices? So we have the vagus nerve stimulator, which has been around for over 25 years now. We have deep brain stimulation, which is approved in Europe, but we haven't done a case in Ireland yet for epilepsy. And responsive neurostimulation which is unfortunately only available in the US at the moment, but hopefully will be available in Europe in the next couple of years. So I'll try to wrap up. Again, an exciting time for developments in epilepsy research. We couldn't do any of this without participation and cooperation from patients and from organisations like Epilepsy Ireland. And it's encouraging to think that there's hundreds and thousands of epilepsy researchers around the world whose goal is to try and improve the lives of people with epilepsy. So that's an encouraging thought, and hopefully we'll see some exciting new developments over the next 5 or 10 years. Thanks.